her observations of people's psychological response to their impending death. And so the change, the curve that we use as an inevitability of change, what we're actually talking about is a death. And the interesting thing is I believe that she never described it as being linear or in a predictable sequence. Popular culture gets the blame for that. And frankly, I blame the bloody management consultants, because they're the ones who continually spin it out time and time again. But it is interesting that what we are talking about is a death when we're talking about organisational change, almost by default. So my question to you is, I believe that organisation change doesn't need to feel like an impending death, but is that a possibility? What are your thoughts?
I'd suggest we have a lot of organisations that actually are dead on their feet and don't know it yet.
Yes, they're in the curve. They're in the spiral of death. They don't know it. They're not paying attention. No, it doesn't need to feel like it. Unfortunately, there are plenty of organisations who actually, in theory, then use this curve, use Kubler-Ross's ideas, and still don't get change right. They don't understand what change is about in many cases.
It's one of the issues that the parallel with grief and change is that the people that are affected by the change or by the death of a person are done to rather than being cooperative. There are very few circumstances in which somebody that we're closely involved, where we wish the death of somebody with whom we're closely involved. Equally, there are very few circumstances in which we want our workplace to be turned over. And we don't have any, we being the employees, don't have any part in the organisational change. We're not consulted. We're done to.
I love that, Brian. Yeah. Anybody want to build on that?
Well, I think we need to understand the assumptions that we tend to make around change. One of the assumptions is that change is traumatic, that it will be resisted, that it's threatening, and that nobody likes change. Well, actually, some people love change. So it's important to understand that there are people within organisations who will be relishing change. Sometimes even change for change's sake, just because they're so bored with the same old, same old. So I think when we make assumptions like that, it's also important to understand not only the assumption, but where it's come from. What is the context that has given rise to that particular belief? So my attitude to change is that it's exciting and fills me with optimism and is an opportunity for people to develop and grow. So why is it that we're not able to communicate change in that way to other people? And so I think that comes down to the context in which change happens, which is usually, as you alluded to, Ben, it's driven from the top, nobody has any say in it, and therefore it happens to them. So I think that the key is to look at the positives in change and see how you can actually make those a reality. What do you need to do to your change programs to make them exciting and engaging for people?
I have a question, if you'll forgive me. That for me, there's a question here of going back to an even more basic assumption, and it's one that I've personally never understood. and that is that change is something special and different, and as managers we do it from time to time.
Mm.
Why do we have to treat change as if it's not something which is happening every day in our job and it's normal, it's just the way we are, but oh damn, we need to make another change, so we'll have a program of some sort? I've never understood that assumption, why it's treated as special and different.
Turning it into the program actually seems to be the thing that destroys its capability, doesn't it?
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. I'm gonna go on, Dan.
No, I was just wishing to raise that and say, I don't understand why it should be treated as something, oh damn, we need another change event of some sort. Don't understand that thinking.
I'd like to raise the simple question: that is there an element of survivor bias in this conversation, because the consultant walks out with a fee and it goes on to his next assignment, but certainly if the arithmetic involves productivity and jobs, the change will result in job loss or reassignment at best, and therefore that fear, it probably doesn't feel a lot different from this grief cycle.
Well, that's because they can't relate the change to the work they're doing. And my question would be, what has happened to organizational development? When I first came to England, that was the big thing that everyone who wanted to understand how to improve organizations or how they could be improved. There was a real school, or a people-focused school of OD, they called it. Yeah. That's faded away, and you had OD, organization development directors, who reported to the managing director or the CEO, and that was so interesting because these people were very humanist in their thinking, and they understood how to manage people through a process of change, which was clearly the first step of which was early involvement of the people. So I think that again, what comes to mind is John Seddon's phrase, command and control, where they were replaced by people from personnel who became the Praetorian Guard for the board. And they regarded their key role as governance, not people. Mm. And so I think that if you look over time, there were people in organizations in this country who did embrace change. They did do things differently, and they were quite happy to look at new ways of doing things. Something shifted there, and I can't quite put my finger on it, but I think it's related to separating management at some point from the work. So a lot of the change was to cut costs or to increase control, and it had bugger all to do with the nature of the work. And so people quite rightly resisted the change because they weren't listened to. And as Deving said, who knows more about the organization than the people who work at the coalface? And I'd be fascinated to know whether you can put your finger on why we stopped this process of engaging the workforce so that they trusted us. Because we lost that trust. When I first worked here, management were trusted and liked by the workforce. By the time I started my own company, management weren't trusted at all in most organizations. And I can't understand what brought that about.
I think John's absolutely right there. There's been a chasm of loss of trust. We call it engagement these days. And to my mind, the deepening slope of that has been down to this view that the shareholder society and rapid gains have allowed the division between managers and everybody else, because the greasy pole and getting your returns out of an organization are now more important than being part of it.
I'm going to offer a carpet bombing and very simplistic response to your question, John, and I'm going to label it bureaucracy.
Okay.
I think, you know, and I say that quite deliberately in the context of our message for this evening, but, you know, we are all talking about control, and, you know, bureaucracy is, you know, that's an instrument of control. We are talking about people being done to. We're talking about the layers of abstraction that Simon Sinek talks about, you know, people managing via the spreadsheet and not looking at those numbers and connecting them with real people in real jobs doing real work. So I think that is how this whole unfortunate thing has unfolded. And just to kind of really boil it down to just one single sentence, you know, for us, it's our contention that it's this sense of losing control and or being controlled that really turns people off change. That is, you know, if we had to pick the one thing, then that is it. And of course, you know, that's what bureaucracy does for us. You know, and no amount of coercing, cajoling, incentivizing, and other means of controlling people into change, you know, none of it fits with what we know about psychology and human motivation, and yet that's what we attempt to do. And sadly, there was an element of that being taught on the MBA module that Dennis and I were part of.
And I think, Ben, that points to why most change programs fail, and that is change management. You know, you cannot actually manage change. You need to create the environment for change to happen, and that's the change that's needed.
Yeah, quite right. That was the title of our second lecture.
All right, okay.
So when I did the MBA program, it was called change management, and I opened the second lecture by stating that change cannot be managed, just to get my revenge. So I think this really underlines what Brian said earlier. You know, what have you lost the moment that you hear of your impending death? You know, hearing that your time is coming is the ultimate loss of control. And I think that kind of cements this idea that it's the control element of our conventional approaches to change that result in the human behavior response that we are taught to expect. So there's a bit of a theme that we return to again and again here, and for Dennis and myself, this is the single most important message of our little discussion this evening. It is how decisions get made, by whom, with what input, and with what transparency that is all important. So, you know, that is kind of a central tenet of the progressive organisations that we are going to be talking a bit about, and I think, you know, it's just an alternative way of articulating this idea of control and being controlled in the context of change. And, you know, there's a lot of tokenism in there in current day organisations, you know, sort of involvement is a word that's used in consultation. Well, you know, for me, for us, for Dennis and I, that doesn't really cut the mustard. You know, you need to give away as much of the decision-making authority as you are able to if you want people to go with you on the journey of change. So we don't think that it's an inevitability, and we pose the question, you know, what if instead of handing over a fait accompli, we just describe, as leaders, we just describe what it was that we're trying to achieve and why, and give away most of the decision-making authority to those affected by the change, and just trust and support them to deliver. And that really is not just the kind of a central tenet of our approach to change, but it's also reflected in the progressive organisations. So I've talked a bit about progressive organisations. Can we just have a thumbs up if that's a term that you're familiar with, or yeah? So Brett, I would expect nothing less of you, sir. Okay, so progressive organisations, kind of by our reckoning, are so progressive organisations, by our reckoning, are pursuing very, very different approaches to management. They began to emerge in the 1960s, Bill Gore, etc. And they set out to build the success of their new and fragile companies, but not on technology or product innovation, but very deliberately setting out to create an environment where people could give of their best. You know, they adopt a mantra of minimum viable bureaucracy. They seek to do everything they can to work with the brain of human beings, from our psychology to how we naturally commune and collaborate our communities, and what we find, you know, rewarding and intrinsically motivational. And you will recognize some of these, I'm sure. Some of them you may not. What I found really, really interesting as I've discovered more about progressive organizations is this sort of idea of concurrent evolution that we see going on. So, you know, from the 1960s, tiny organizations growing up in very different parts of the world with no apparent connection seem to have grown and developed and adopted very, very similar operating models and management philosophies. You know, in 1960, I mentioned Bill Gore-Tex. He set out to create a bureaucracy-free organization. That was his experience from DuPont. There were pockets of DuPont where people were just allowed to crack on and do, and they weren't in any way controlled or hindered, and they were massively successful. But then, as soon as their ideas began to get traction, they would bump up against the bureaucracy, and all the momentum would be lost, and people would be frustrated, and all of that value would just sort of dissipate. So that was going on in the 1960s, 1970s. This guy, Ricardo Semler, inherited a business down in Brazil. He decided that modern day management practices weren't going to be fit for purpose for him. He started again with a blank sheet of paper, started experimenting, and he too has come up with some strikingly similar ways of working, ways of managing. And you know, in the company I'm in at the moment, I don't need to remind you guys that sort of 1960s and 70s, the good Dr. D was, you know, starting his stuff, coming up with his great ideas, and the Japanese miracle, the Toyota production system was kicking off in Japan, again with some very, very, very strikingly similar things in their DNA. And my explanation for that is, if it shouldn't be a surprise, if you are very, very deliberately setting out to organize and manage in a way that will work with the brain of our psychology, sociology, even anthropology, then, and you're going to do that by trial and error and experimentation, probably shouldn't come as a great surprise that there is a bit of similarity between the answers that people arrive at, because the raw material is the same. Human beings the world over are largely kind of similar. And to bring that right forward to almost the present day, if you look at the common and principal threads within our model of the change-enabled organization, and that research first done by Dennis back end of the 80s, early noughties, and then repeated again in 2010, again, remarkably similar kind of principles and ideas. And, you know, we're not the first ones to trip over this stuff. So in much more recent times, post-internet, couple of Dutch guys, disillusioned with their corporate employers, decided to chuck in their jobs and embark on a voyage of discovery to find out more about, you know, self-management and progressive organizations. And they called themselves corporate rebels. And I owe to them an awful lot of what I've learned, you know, in terms of progressive organisations. So to date, they visited about 200 progressives all around the globe, and they too have noticed exactly the same parallel evolution going on. Now, in current day, it's very much harnessed by the power of communication that we all enjoy, internet, etc. But strikingly similar. All of the organisations that they have studied have defined their own path. They've done it largely by experimentation, but they have arrived with some very, very kind of common threads. And just to kind of, as an attempt to sort of bring this to life, I thought we might just take a closer look at one of those progressive organisations, and I've decided to pick a particularly large one. So who has heard of HARE? Who's heard of HARE? John, Brett, Dan? Yeah, okay. So yeah, I guess they are the largest company in the Western world, that, you know, largest company that the Western world has never heard of, I should say. Not in the Western world. Well, they are. They've just bought Tandy in Italy. So 77,000 people, largest white goods manufacturer on the planet. And they are the absolute epitome of an organisation that has innovated their management first and their product second, and they've done it very, very successfully. To put it another way, they've combined, you know, what should have been the second management revolution that should have probably happened in the 1960s, as we've said, with the fourth industrial revolution technology, and they've been incredibly successful. So, yeah, this sort of maps their positive trajectory from 1984. And not only have they reinvented their product offering, as the slopey line depicts, they've also continually reinvented the way that they organize, going from a very conventional kind of top-down pyramid to a matrix, to nested pyramids, to inverted nested pyramids, to a network organization, which, you know, those of you who know Dennis and I well will know that every organization is a networked organization. That's the reality when you unpick it all. To where they are now, which is how they describe themselves as an ecosystem of micro-organizations of probably no more than certainly 20 people, typically 10 or 12, with absolute autonomy, just to go and play in their environment. The journey is quite an interesting one. So they started off in a ramshackle factory, and with poor products and poor reputation, and in a mature market, that's really not a great start in life. So the guy that has led the journey, Zhang Rumin, this fella, grew up as a lathe operator. So that's interesting. Back to our previous conversation, I think it was Stuart said, you know, few people grow up in the work. Well, he absolutely did. Very open to ideas of others, voracious reader of management literature. And there's a couple of bits of corporate theatre that are quite interesting. So at one stage, he invited 76 of his top people to go into the main hall of their production facility, equipped them all with sledgehammers and other similar instruments, and invited them just to smash up 76 refrigerators that they had on the shop floor that had been identified as being substandard. And yeah, at the time, one of those refrigerators worth the equivalent of a 2-year salary for the people working on the shop floor. So it's quite a deeply symbolic thing for him to say, we have to be all about quality. And then the other thing that he did, you know, in good times, he made 12,000 middle managers redundant. Shock horror, I see you recall. But he did that, and in the next breath invited them all back in to form their own micro organizations funded by the overarching organization to go and play and do real innovative work, whether that was in terms of new products or whether that was new innovative ways of work in R&D or in manufacture or whatever. And that has been the modus operandi that has stuck with that organization kind of ever since. And he's been studied by Bill Fisher over in the States. He talks in a very, very animated way about change at Haier. So, you know, multiple reinventions over 40 years. Change is continual. It's not episodic or programmatic in any way. It's always enacted at a time of strength when people are feeling good about themselves, when resources are abundant. So this is front foot change. This is being the disruptor change, not shit, we've got to catch up change. And it is all founded on harnessing the entrepreneurial energy of people at the front line of the organization, as opposed to asking people within the organization to execute someone else's plans. And Bill kind of summarizes that by saying, you know, in 10-person micro enterprises who are working at the edge, his expression, meaning at the edge in terms of cutting edge technology, but also at the edge, meaning boundary of the organization and the interfaces with the customers and the interfaces with the people that they collaborate on technology with. You know, we'll always come up with infinitely better ideas, infinitely faster than kind of any corporate strategy group. John, you've got a question.
What are their products?
White goods, John. Fridges, freezers, washing machines. Very interestingly, there's a Currys ad running at the moment, and their products have just arrived at our shores. So it's, yeah, they bought GE appliances 5 years ago, Brett, was it? 5.6 billion quid. So they're already in the States. They bought they bought out Tandy in Italy. So a really, really compelling story of what happens when you let go and you distribute decision-making authority to people throughout the organization. So, John.
When you've worked, well, we've all worked sometime in a high-performing team, although we may not have known it at the time, the contrast is extreme. And my observation is that people who are in a place where they feel good, naturally are collaborative and innovative. And yet the majority of workplaces are full of people in suits saying, I wish my people would bloody innovate.
Yes. Yeah. I think it's interesting also, if you think about the way that, the way that you've described it, Ben, and how this organization works, it has exactly the same kind of like autonomous structuring and thinking about management that Stafford Beer had about in management cybernetics, which is to allow the maximum amount of autonomy to, you know, recursive units and make sure the structure for their function works well. So in a way, they've done the viable systems model, but without having done VSM at all. They've just done it.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely another example of kind of concurrent evolution that we're talking about, isn't it? You know, we arrive in the same place via a very different pathway because we've adopted similar principles along the way, right? The organization is a system, it's not a machine.
What's a recursive unit, Tony, please? I don't know that term.
The idea of recursive structure is one where you see the same pattern you know, in multiple layers. So you see it at the corporate layer, and then in the layer below, and then in the layer below, and then in the layer below. And in theory, it's infinite in every direction, from the cell level to the universe, but encompasses organizations, individuals, teams. So recursion in biology and recursion in management cybernetics is exactly the same mechanism. It's based on Maturana and Aurelius thinking.
You're going to say, yeah, yeah.
Could somebody post me a link to that? It's interesting.
Yeah,
I have another question for Ben about this company, and I'm full of remorse for not having ever heard of it. But there you go.
Well,
that's
I'm here, John.
The NHS. My question is, how did they discover the demand? Well, you know, at the end of the day, there has to be a demand for these white goods. Now, what was it that they discovered that they could either turn into a demand or an unmet demand that made them successful?
So if we look at their current and latest iteration,
yeah,
they were working on this idea of Internet of Things and hyper connection probably 5 or 10 years ago. And they will emerge around the world, I have no doubt, as being the, you know, the go-to producer of goods that are smart and connected, and whether we think that's a good thing or not, you know, I personally think there's a problem there, that there's a solution there that doesn't have a problem in the first place. I don't need my fridge to tell me that it's going to run out of milk, but you know, that is the way that it's going to go, and their approach to letting people go out, follow their curiosity, empowering them, supporting their innovative thinking and their experimentation and their prototyping, and looking for new and novel ideas and technologies has served them very, very well. You know, given they started as an absolute kind of backmarker, and you know, it would be German and Japanese white goods manufacturers that were seen as leading the way. And over a period of 40 years, they seem to have been able to overtake them and generate their own demand.
Okay, and I have a supplementary question. I noticed that interface wasn't mentioned as part of your repertoire of companies that you quoted there, and they took the lead in environmental organizational thinking 25 years ago with Ray Anderson, and they were the first company that I knew that took as their target, as their goal, to be totally whatever they made caused there was no waste at all.
Yeah.
Either in and yet they just made carpets. That's all they made, really.
Yeah.
And they've done a brilliant job, particularly in Holland, their factories in Holland. And I wondered to what extent this guy and his company are good for the environment.
Great question. Great question. And the honest answer is, John, I don't know. I don't know. Brett maybe has the inside track on that. I mean, the reason I chose to talk about them was very often when you talk about distributed authority, people say, well, yeah, that's fine for a 100-person organization. But, you know, as Brett has recently had a guy on his podcast who said something that really struck me along the lines of, Brett, you'll probably correct me on this, who said, given that your organization is such a massively complex and adaptive system, the only management process that works is a highly distributed, equally complex system. It's kind of Ashby's law of requisite variety applied to the organism of an organisation. So I can't speak of their environmental credentials, but what I do know is they've been highly, highly innovative in the management space.
Thank you.
My understanding, Ben, is that they basically have 4,000 individual micro-enterprises. So the average unit size is around about 20 individuals. And as micro-enterprises, they're free to trade with each other, they're free to trade outside of the organisation. But within that, there will be consulting groups and market research groups. So they have the opportunity for those mechanisms to arise naturally according to need. And the other thing, Ben, of course, is that they don't refer to their workers as workers or employees, they refer to them as entrepreneurs. And that's the idea, is that they just get on and do what's needed. And it seems to work very well. And the quote from Tom that you were alluding to there, Ben, was everything that is large and complex can only be managed in a distributed, self-organizing way, which is the contrary of most management theory. Is the bigger it is, the more control you need, but actually the opposite is the truth. So, yeah.
Thanks, Brett. Really good. All right, I've just noticed the time, so I'm going to whiz us on, if that's okay. Cool. So you've seen this before. This is the corporate rebels kind of themes, and you know, the pioneers of these progressive organisations set out to create places of work that were specifically designed to liberate the very best that people had to offer. To their principal strategy for competitive advantage was, let's work the way that humans work. They never set out to resolve the kind of age-old, long-standing challenge of how do we tackle the human side of change. But it's interesting that, you know, in deliberately setting out to create an environment where people were able to give their best, they kind of arrived at this place where change just becomes a natural emergent property of the organization. And they do not have the same urge as conventional organizations to do, to sort of change by episode, change by, you know, upheaval, change by program. So look, I think corporate rebels have done us a great favor by identifying these eight trends. I think they're really, really helpful. I think they echo a lot of what our own research says, and I think they also echo this idea that we shared with you already in terms of, you know, it's how decisions get made and by whom, with what input and with what transparency. That is all important, whether we're talking about change or whether we're talking about day-to-day management. Really, really important. All this is great, and Hay is an amazing story and very instructive and inspirational, but you know, we need to accept that we are not starting an organization from scratch. We're not looking at a blank sheet of paper where we can come up with a management structure of our choosing or a management philosophy that we think we're going to work. We are all, you know, we are all in some way or other set in a current reality, and that reality can be quite challenging. And it's very easy to look at those progressive organizations and come up with lots of reasons why we couldn't do that. And one of the principal reasons that why we can't do that is, oh, Ben, what power do I have? What authority to change do I have? And that's where Dennis and I would really like to introduce you guys to the model of the change-enabled organization. Because what that helps us to do is to make changes at an individual level in terms of our own management practices and behaviours that will, whatever our sphere of influence, enable that change enablement to occur. So I'm not going to say a huge amount about the model. Dennis, I think, will take you through some outputs, and then we'll talk about, we'll give you the opportunity to experiment with some data. But I think it's important just for me to clarify what the model is not. And unlike many models, it's not a graphical representation of a pet theory or concept. You know, as useful as those things can be in terms of stimulating good conversation, that is not what it is. What it is well, at its heart, it's a piece of artificial intelligence that identifies the key change enabling and key change disabling characteristics of organizations. But better than that, the intelligence has a diagnostic capability, and it's able to track from those characteristics back to what the causes are for that specific organization at that specific moment in time. And I think what we hope you will experience in working with the data that we're going to share is it is so much easier to work at the level of underlying causes than it is to try and address symptoms. So there's a lot of intelligence in there. It's based on empirical research of more than 70 organizations, and Dennis bears the mental scars of drawing up the 70,000 formula which were embedded in the inference engine. So the important thing, I think, that I know Dennis will be really keen to emphasize, is that it is not a one-to-one relationship ever between the characteristics and their causes. This is a many-to-many relationship, and just as you know, Tony has kind of described, you know, this sort of idea of recursion and complexity. It helps to grapple with that complexity. Dennis, is this a good point for me to hand over to you?
Yeah, if I may, I'll just give you a very tiny piece of history and then explain how this thing evolved. It started with intense curiosity about why some organizations seem to be able to turn on a sixpence and others couldn't turn at all. We wanted to know the reason why and how we could get a valid measure of this. And the problem that we faced in the research was we didn't know what we were looking for. We just had this vague idea that characteristics of the organization must be in some way caused by what people do, what managers do specifically. And we therefore started by chucking everything at the exercise and ended up with the most horrendous, complicated model, which was completely useless as a practical working tool. Very interesting and very insightful, but completely useless. And what we got it down to was, on the left-hand side of this diagram, 26 inputs. And these are descriptions of typical management behavior. And there's two columns, and the question is always, is that a perfect description of what you observe, or is it the one on the right, or are we somewhere in between? And we chose that because what we didn't want to do was ask direct questions, because then you get data contamination and distortions and political responses and all the usual sort of garbage. So we said, well, we know what the characteristics are. We've discovered that. What are the inputs to the model? And let's just work with what people observe, what they experience. So you get this, as Ben said, many model, 26 inputs, 15 outputs, but there are no simple, linear, simple relationships in sight. One input will impact many outputs. One output will be impacted by many inputs. So where we go from there is we ask people to answer these questions, which are simple descriptions of what they observe. They don't know what we're measuring, so there are no political responses possible. There's no judgmental questions. And then we use the inference engine to work out where the organization is in terms of its capability for change. And we can illustrate that best with a few charts. Ben, could we have the next slide? If you look on the right-hand side of that picture, you see an index of 72%. So out of the theoretically maximum possible, this organization is sitting at 72% in terms of its capability for constantly changing. And that's the highest index we've ever recorded, the highest. If you look at the left-hand chart, you see a green line and a red line. And the issue here is that we treat the positive indicators and the negative indicators differently and draw out their effects. So the green line should be as large as possible. It should enclose the greatest area. And the red line should be as small as possible. It should enclose the smallest area. And you can see that here is an organization which got a lot of good things going for it and not too much in terms of grief. And you look at the right-hand chart, which has got the blue line, and quite simply that is the aggregated scores from positive inputs and negative inputs put into one. And that's what's used to calculate the index. And the blue line should be as small as possible. So you've got there an organization which is actually in pretty good shape, although it's got a long way to go before it gets to 100%. We doubt very much that any organization will ever be at 100% because of regulation, bureaucracy, blah-de-blah-de-blah, all those things that get in the way. But that's the very simple way that this model represents its reports. If we could have the next one, Ben. Here you see an organization where the index is now down to 41%. The blue line is considerably larger. And on the first chart, the red line is now enclosing a bigger area than the green one. And this is an organization with significant problems. And the argument here is unless they tackle some of the spikes, experiential learning, how they work with that, product and service focus, cross-functional working, focus of time horizons and so on. Unless they start to tackle some of these things, the organization will not cope well with a hugely changeable environment, which is what we've got right now. In passing, by the way, has anyone noticed the number of organizations that are making huge numbers of redundancies in the head office management factory? Mm-hmm. Several doing it. Another one this week, Marks and Spencer's, 9,500 redundancies, but all coming from management. You say people are beginning to wake up. The pandemic's done something. Mm-hmm. But if you think that organization has problems, try the next one. And this is the lowest index we've ever recorded, the lowest. And you can see that the blue line is almost escaping from the limitations of the chart. And the green dot in the middle says not a lot of good news around in this particular organization. But the key here is that these are symptoms. They are symptoms of the organization's ability to keep changing or not, as the case may be. And that doesn't actually lead us terribly far in the direction of knowing what to do about it. So Ben, could we whiz through to the next one, please?
Yeah.
So if you just think back, I mean, this is a typical organization, and there were 3 spikes on the blue chart. The degree to which leadership is distributed throughout the organization, their approach to risk, were they risk disabled or risk enabled, and how strategy was developed, the degree to which that is emergent as well as top and formal. So the question is, if you were faced with those 3 challenges, how would you tackle them? Any thoughts?
Mm.
Difficult, isn't it?
What sort of size would that organisation be?
Well, this is in practice. Let me just pause. All of these organisations all three of those were into the several thousand. Not as big as Haya, but nevertheless substantial organisations. By the way, in the research, we found no correlation whatsoever between the size of organisations and their ability to change. Some very large organisations are absolutely brilliant at it, and some small ones are absolute crap. So the correlation wasn't there with size. But back to this screen, pick any one of those, and how do you fix it? And the answer is basically you can't, because we don't know what's causing them. But one of the joys of the change-enabled organizations model is we can take, if we took the leadership distribution one, for example, we can go back into the database and track through the 26 inputs and find the big hitters, which are the inputs to the model which mainly contributed to that particular output to say you got a problem. And once we know what the causes were, then they're relatively easy to fix, which hopefully we can illustrate with the next slide. The bad news on the left, the good news on the right.
Is that legible for people?
Yeah.
Yeah, good.
Yep.
Fine.
Now, you could take any one of those inputs on the left-hand side and say, well, if we want to be like the ones on the right-hand side, how do we do that? And the answer is actually, it's pretty straightforward. You stop doing that and do something different, for goodness sake. Just take the very first one. Stop asking silly questions about recent or current results, the financial numbers, the management accounts, all that sort of crap. And start asking questions about what people are doing to change the way we operate to improve performance.
Dennis, whilst that might be possible to sort of do that shift, how do you actually get managers, in particular senior managers and boards, to make that change in behaviour? Because that for me is you get the shadow of the leader effect. We know that happens in organisations all the time. So you can intervene perhaps in the middle, but if you don't address the senior level, it often gets squashed. So how do you get to that level?
Well, let me just, I think the answer is in the way that we work with these organisations, but let me just give you a little example recently, which was a company which had an index in the high 60s. And we fed back to the CEO and we said, don't be distressed about this high 60s. The biggest score we've ever had is 72%. And his immediate question was, well, tell me what I've got to do to get to be first. That was his absolutely instant response. And we said, okay, we'll dig through the database, change these three things. He said, well, I'll do it. But the true answer to your question, John, is that we make that a condition of doing the work in the first place. Unless you, the board of directors, the CEO or whomever, are not willing to sign up to processing the data and introducing the indicated changes, we're not going to do it. Simply won't do it.
Can I come in here then? Because I think and this is one of the things that I think is really important. I think it's a question of unconscious incompetence.
Mm-hmm.
And I think too often we don't help people at the top. We don't explain how to do things.
No.
And let me give you a simple example. When we were doing a major project with Sainsbury's on the construction program, their big cry was partnership. We early involvement of the suppliers, the contractors and things like that, and partnership. And when it came to running meetings, it was always the Sainsbury's project manager who ran the meetings, and he ran the meeting the Sainsbury's way. And at coffee, our consultant said to him, "So how do you think the meeting's going?" And he said, "Well, I'm not very happy." He said, "People don't appear to be cooperating." And so the guy said to him, "Well, can you recall how many questions you've asked them? And I invited them to speak." There was a long pause, and he said, "No." And our consultant said, "None." And of the 18 people at the meeting, you have occupied 40% of the time when it comes to speaking. Did you know that? His reaction was a bit like the former one, "What must I do?" And the guy just said to him, "Ask a bloody question." The kind of question you should ask is something like, "Does anyone know how we do this?" And to his credit, and the consultant said, "And I'll sit next to you, and I'll prompt you if you don't."
Yes.
And he asked 2 questions, and the meeting changed entirely.
Yes.
And he got, and in terms of feedback, that was the best feedback he could have got.
Yes, well, absolutely, totally agree with that. And certainly the sort of questions we ask, whether they're informal meetings or not, doesn't matter. The sort of questions we ask, it turns out, are absolutely critical for success.
Yeah. Okay.
The minute we say to somebody, "Well, what do you suggest we do?" And then when the suggestion comes, "Well, why are you asking? Why are you raising it? Why haven't you already done it?" Stop bringing silly things like this to the meeting and get on and do it. Let's have a little bit less talking and a bit more doing. But I agree, and the questions are absolutely critical. But the key issue here is to get that shift from the left-hand side of this list, and these are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 out of the 26 input questions. Then getting that shift is, relatively speaking, easy to do. It doesn't require change programs. It just requires a shift in management behavior. And John's absolutely right. We have to be completely honest with people and say, "Well, this is what's happening now, and you've got to stop it."
Cool.
Comfort with that thought. I would like to, with apologies, take us all the way back to the beginning of this conversation where we talked about assumptions. And here's some more assumptions. Number 1, people at the top have the illusion of control. They confuse their short-term financial numbers with the real business. This is the old story about the map is not the territory. But it gives them the illusion of control because they get all these numbers and the weekly and monthly reports. And that's all absolutely fantastic, completely and utterly meaningless. But it gives them comfort and they think they're in control. They may also suffer the illusion of power, and they confuse positional authority with the power to actually make change happen. Then there's the illusion of no power. That's people in the middle of the organization thinking they can't make change happen. And I think our argument is, if we concentrate on management practices and processes, the sort of inputs to the change-enabled organization model, then we can make huge change happen, because the inputs are little changes and the outputs are huge. So that's one of the things that we would like to leave you with as a last thought, is that we're all actually much more powerful than we think we are. Ben?
Nice one. Thanks, Den. Yeah, so we are officially out of time. It's been a great conversation. Thank you all for your time and your energy. Dennis and I will be circulating to all of you the change-enabled organisations model, so you can take a look at that and pick a couple of lines that you think you would like to work on with your people and get to it. And if there's any more support that you feel that you'd need, we're always delighted to have these sorts of conversations. But I am keen to wrap up because I'm now occupying your evening, and that wasn't part of the deal. But are there any sort of final questions, observations, just before we go our separate ways and perhaps pour ourselves a glass of something cool and refreshing?
I'm delighted by Dennis's closing note there that we are more powerful than we think we are, because, you know, the conversation has shifted from trying to divine the reasons why managerial structures are not doing what they think they're doing and feeling disempowered, to now realizing that there is a glimmer of insight that can be replayed into doing something practical, and that's the best possible outcome.
Thanks, John. Nice summary. Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts? I guess there's a shameless plug, and that is that if you have enjoyed this evening, a similar show will be, so Dennis and I are going to do a rerun of this particular session in a week's time during the day and not the evening, if that suits other people. So if you have enjoyed the session, if you feel you know people in your network who might find it interesting, engaging, helpful, or otherwise amusing, please do let them know. We would be delighted to have them along. It's open to absolutely everyone, members of the DA or not. And Dennis and I would love your feedback as well, so that we can make that session even better. So pretty sure you all know how to get in touch with us. If not, come back via John. And thank you very much indeed for your time, and see you at another one of these. Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Cheers. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.